Hello, I'm Rivka Galchen. I'm very delighted to get to welcome you to our event today at the most unusual 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival. We're here in the special room today with the authors Mia Couto, Curdella Forbes, and Andrés Neuman. Before we begin, I wanted to remind everyone that books by the authors in this program can be purchased in the link at the bottom. So let me just share, all three of these authors are tremendously celebrated, fantastic authors. I'll read you very brief bios. Author Andrés Neuman was born in 1977 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and grew up in Spain. He was selected as one of Granta's best of young Spanish language novelists and was elected to the Bogota 39 list. His novel, Traveler of the Century, was the winner of the Alfaguara Prize and the National Critics Prize, Spain's two most prestigious literary awards. His most recent novel is Fracture. Curdella Forbes was born in Jamaica and is the author of several novels. She lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and teaches Caribbean literature at Howard University. And her most recent novel, which we'll be talking about today, is A Tall History of Sugar. And Mia Couto was born in Mozambique in 1955, is one of the most prominent writers in Portuguese-speaking Africa, and most recently the author of The Sword and the Spear. After studying medicine and biology, he worked as a journalist and headed several Mozambican national newspapers and magazines. Couto has been awarded the Camões Prize for Literature and the prestigious Neustadt International Prize for Literature, among other awards. He was also shortlisted for the 2017 Impact Dublin Literary Award and was a finalist for the Man Booker International Prize in 2015. He lives in Maputo, where he works as a biologist. So we thought we would begin with having each writer read a short excerpt from their book, and maybe we could begin with Mia, who is reading from The Sword and the Spear, the second in his trilogy. Thanks so much.
Okay. Sorry, can I propose to read the first volume of this is a trilogy. This is the first volume of the trilogy that I published in Portuguese first, and then it was translated into English and published in England and in the United States. So I'll read the first page of the first chapter of the first volume of this trilogy. So it's just 2 minutes, I think. Each morning, 7 suns would rise over the plains of Inharim. In those times, the firmament was much larger, and all the stars were contained within it, the living and the dead. Naked, just as she had slept, our mother would leave the house, a sieve in her hand. She was going to choose the best of the suns. With her sieve, she would gather up the remaining 6 stars and bring them back to the village. She would bury them next to the anthill behind our house. That was our graveyard for heavenly creatures. One day, if we ever needed to, we would go and unearth stars. With such a bequest, we were not poor. That's what our mother, Shikazi Makwakwa, said, or just Mami in our native language. Whoever visited us would be aware of the other reason for this belief. It was in the anthill that we buried the placentas of newborn babies. A mafura tree had taken root on the top of it. We would tie white clothes around its trunk, and it was there that we talked to our dead. But the anthill was the opposite of a cemetery. It was a guardian of the rains, and within it dwelt our eternity. One day, when the morning had been well sieved, a boot trampled on the sun that mother had chosen. It was a military boot, like those worn by the Portuguese. This time, however, it was worn by a Nguni soldier. The soldier has been sent by the Emperor Ngungunyan. Emperors hunger for land, and the soldiers are mouths that devour nations. That boot shattered the sun into 1,000 pieces, and the day turned to darkness, all the other days as well. The 7 suns were dying under the soldiers' boots. Our land has been gobbled up. Devoid of stars to nourish our dreams, we learned to be poor. And we lost our eternity too, knowing that eternity is merely another name for life. Okay, that's it.
That was so beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Curdella?
That was so beautiful, Mia. Thank you.
Thank you, Curdella.
Thank you. So, Tall History of Sugar is what I'm reading from. And this is a novel about history couched as a fairy tale. And I'm reading exactly one page, the very first page. Long ago, when teachers were sent from Britain to teach in the grammar schools of the West Indian colonies, it was Great Britain then, not Little England as it is now after Brexit and the fall of empire. There lived in Jamaica near a town called Aracabessa-on-Sea, a poor fisherman and his wife who was a farmer and a seamstress. And one morning they found a pale child in bushes in a basket made of reeds. The man's name was Noah Fisher, and his wife's name was Rachel. They adopted the child and named him Moshe, which is to say Moses, which in translation means drawn out. And they named him in this way because Rachel was a Yahwehist, and because the bushes in which they found him were a tangle of sea grapes running low as a reed bed along the ground on cliffs above the sea. And when she found him, for it was she who first saw the child, the spray from below had made a pool around the basket, so in another few moments it would have sailed. Which is to say that in a manner of speaking, the little boy was indeed drawn out of water. The grandmother, a long-headed woman of the countryside, tells me, "You don't need Figodessa. You don't need this long explanation of watery origins, since the ancestors of every Jamaican came over the sea, most of them in the ship's caca. And moreover, are we not an island surrounded by water? So anyone born and found here is a child of water, and no more to be said." Well, this child that was found did not look like anyone who came over in the hulls of ships 300 years ago. So it is important to give all the details of his name and how he was found.
Thank you. That's mesmerizing. Andrés?
Yes, certainly. I picked 2 one-minute readings from Fracture, the new novel. It's just 2 small paragraphs. This is one of the characters presenting a personal catalog of laughters. I've always thought that the way we laugh reveals who we really are. We can put on a face, adopt a tone, control our gestures, but it's very difficult to laugh insincerely. I've known laughs that are nervous like their owners, tight-lipped laughs that conceal more than they show, or shrill laughs desperate for attention. Some are strangely long-winded and don't want to end as if masking pain, while others grow gradually louder as they gain confidence. Some are a single burst that cleaves the air before snapping shut like a knife. Others sound rough because they've been through a lot. None of this describe his laugh. And secondly, this is Mariela talking about their son when they came back from their exile in London and returned to Argentina. At the end of the dictatorship, when we told him we were going home, my son Ari had wanted to take his English radio with him, a small yellow plastic transistor which he would fall asleep listening to every night. We told him that we could buy another in Buenos Aires, but he insisted on bringing it with him, and so we packed it in our hand luggage. My husband Emilio and I were on edge throughout the journey. I remember we had an argument at the airport. We weren't sure what had messed up our son's life more, leaving or returning home. Ari was totally relaxed during the flight. It was his first long haul, and he kept pointing out the window and asking questions about Argentina. He even fell asleep for a few hours, something neither his dad nor I was capable of doing. No sooner had we landed than poor Ari turned on his radio and discovered he couldn't find any of his favorite stations. Then he burst into tears and cried all day. He was about 5 years old. I'll never forget that.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And actually, you know, I wanted to follow up on that image of Addie and of that child who is sort of very substantially connected, not to one place, but to several places, and not really in his own control. Just sort of history has sort of cast him about and given him all these connections. And I see that as something both across the characters of all three of these books, and actually across the authors of all three of these books. And one way into that I wanted to ask you all about is, it leaves you in a more interesting place when you're finding a tone and a voice for your book. It's not obviously going to be, there's less of a choice of an invisible voice for your books. And each of you have come up with very different solutions to it. And all of you have more than one voice operating in your book. So I guess I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit to how you solve not just the moment in history that you're looking at or the story that you're looking at, but the telling of it, the way that it's told and who's telling it. All of you have interesting solutions to it. Maybe we could start, maybe we'll start actually with Andrés and go the other way from how we started. So you have at least 5 voices in your book.
I like the at least. That sounded like mysterious. No, you're right. You're totally right. Well, I think that first of all, searching for a voice, literally speaking, is a way of being a stranger, realizing we're all strangers in a way or another. You can be a stranger in a migrant way, and my family certainly exiled and changed culture and even continent. But I do think that even though you have stayed for all your life in the same place, part of your identity can be found elsewhere. That's the whole point of culture, and our background is like that. So I do find fascinating to try to turn the radio on, to follow with a metaphor, searching for the right dial before telling the plot. I don't think that the voice comes after the plot, but sometimes the voice informs and determines the argument, which is of course important. And another thing important in this regard is that a changing voice makes you feel more poetical towards language, not taking for granted that you know who you are and how your voice is, but you are learning all the time how to write. I think that literature is very much about realizing we don't know how to write or read, and searching for a new voice, sometimes a few times in the same book, makes you feel that very sharply, and I get moved very often about that, and as well I get lost very often.
Mm.
You know, Curdella, one thing that I found so moving in its whole history of sugar is that even within one character, even when Ariane is in some ways like telling her
Ventriloquizing in a way,
she herself shifts between different voices. And I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about that decision or discovery of her.
Yeah, it's interesting that Andres talked about your voice coming out of different people, as it were. You're more than one person influences your voice, or you're speaking from a place where different people live, and also the idea of how do you read. You have to learn to read, and that part about how you have to read really interested me, because part of what Ariane, the narrator, does is talk about a lot is the idea of translation. You always have to be translating somebody else, and there's a way in which, of course, she's telling the story of somebody else, and very often inhabits his voice. You know, but she's also speaking about him from the perspective of different people and different perspectives in the society. So she's very much a kind of shapeshifter, in that way, you know. And near the end of the book, then the story, she says, you know, you can't tell somebody else's story without it also becoming your story. And so she dances between this third person, involved person who knows him so well, she can take his voice out of his head, but also telling her own story as a narrative eye. So I thought about her very carefully, both as she becomes the voice of somebody who is an outsider / insider. And so she had to be, in a way, your sort of arch translator, which means being able to inhabit his voice. But also she comes from a place where I keep saying that when people ask me sometimes in interviews that a tall history of sugar could only have happened in a place like Jamaica, where part of her way of telling is very much telling how Jamaica sounds and how Jamaica sees Moshe, you know, who is the big issue that everybody has to come to terms with in a very real way. And they have to come to terms with somebody who is, you know, the very outside of their acceptance of difference. If people accept difference a lot, and that's a huge paradox here, because they end up having to deal with the extreme example of difference that somehow doesn't fit anymore.
And Mia, you come up with many ways of doing this, but I was particularly interested in your the way you use letters in the novel.
Yeah, I choose you know, the Portuguese. There's two voices in the book. One is Imani. She comes from the African roots. She's an African girl, and I would say that I'll read something that the way she's presenting herself. She says, "My name is Imani. The name I was given is not a name. In my mother tongue, Imani means who's there." So you knock on the door, and from inside, someone asks, "Imani?" So my identity was merely a question, as if I was a shadow without a body, the endless wait for an answer. So she's looking for something that is impossible to reach, to find it, which is her own identity. And it's not a coincidence, it's not by chance that I choose her as a translator. She's a translator that is contracted by the Portuguese to help them to be connected with the African reality. So the Portuguese guy, which is the other voice, I choose the way he's intervening in the book is by letters, because he belongs to the written world, in contrast with the money that comes from the orality. So I think these two different places of constructing their own voices gives the book these two dimensions that I wanted to construct.
Oh, Curdella?
Yes. Okay.
Oh, it looked like you were going to say something. I was.
No, I wasn't. I thought you were addressing me. Sorry. I can hear you. Yes.
I was going to transition on the question. All of you found yourself, and often in other novels you've written as well, moving into the past. So Mia moved more than 100 years into the past. Curdella's, your book reaches up to the present moment, but is also very interested both in 50 years ago and in 500 years ago. All of that feels very present in the book. And Andrés also, his book is in some ways grounded closer to our present, but very interested in the way the past is living in the present. So I wanted to ask you guys a little bit what it was that sent you literally back in time in the sort of substance and geography and place that you set your book, as opposed, I mean, what is it that you can do in a historical novel that's different than a historical nonfiction? What was it that was possible for you in the fictional form that let you talk about a moment of history, and how you chose the center of the book, or how it chose you? Maybe Curdella, maybe you could start.
Yeah, it very much shows me. I didn't know where the book was going to go until it said, "Hey, let's, please follow me." And I started with a particular issue that bothered me, and that had to do with my awareness of race in the United States. You know, I've lived here for 17 years, and I was always struck by the issue of race in a way that you're not struck about it when you live in the Caribbean, certainly not in Jamaica. Like, it colors everything, more or less. I remember reading a piece of research, and I think that was the one that pushed me over the edge, that said that, you know, when people see anyone, the first thing they think about is their race. And I began to think, well, suppose there was somebody born whose race you couldn't tell. And what then? You know, how would that recalibrate how you think about the whole world? And that's how Moshe got born, you know. And once I thought about him, you know, how do I make him look like somebody who doesn't look like anybody else? You know, and he, even in a country where racial mixture and many different iterations of what people look like, you know, are up just there, you know, what would make him strike everybody else as different? And it just made a connection suddenly. Certainly, I think inevitably, if you're talking about racial mixture and what he looks like in Jamaica or anywhere, I think in the Americas, you're going to have to go back into history. It just was that way. You know, I think, how did he come about? What is the connection? What is that whole story about race? Where does it come from? How has it continued to impact Jamaica? How does it now, you know, come up in a different way because of the way this boy looks, and what is his struggle? It's interesting that he never comes to the United States. I thought he would when the book started out, but it sent him to England instead to look for his father, whom he doesn't find, you know. But there's a resonance with America, which Arian talks about as well, because they do come, well, he does come eventually, but not to live. Yeah, so that was it. It just seemed inevitable that I had to go back there. And especially, I'm talking a bit more than I want to, but just very quickly to say that, particularly because I was also couching it as a fairy tale, because this guy has to be something. I have to find a frame to talk about somebody who doesn't look like anybody you've ever seen, but he's obviously human. Is that I've always thought about fairy tales as a very intriguing way, a very sort of necessary way of talking about history. Because I've always thought the fairy tale is this, you know, the ordinary people's way of talking about history in a dangerous way, you know, kind of thing. And so it just seemed to come together that way. I didn't start out thinking it would, but it just automatically led there.
I'd say that, I don't know if you will agree with this, but all novels, all fictions are historical in a more visible or invisible way, because there are social tensions even in an intimate story that seems to take place in the present, but you see the effects that the past has had. And just what we call historical novels are just more explicit ways of underlining which has always been there in literature. And I do think that the great thing about historical fiction, as we know it, is that you can delve into feelings of the characters, and thinking about politics in a more emotional way. What interests me more in historical fiction is not history, but the intimacy of how every character lives through fiction. And as for the past, for instance, in my novel Fracture, what really interested me was telling a love story through time, seeing how changes in space or time can shift our identity. The character learns a new language, for instance, and very much translates his own feelings all the time, or learns a new culture, and then he realizes that he's becoming someone else. So I think there's definitely a link between the concept of translation, traveling, and memory. And I think these three forces are pretty much summarize the art of novel.
Interesting.
Well, I can say that in my case, for this particular book, I travel to the places where let's say, the action takes place, and I realized that the past that was you know, interesting me is because it was hiding something from the present, and the people that want I want to them to be the kind of source of information, they didn't want to talk. They say this is still so present. I mean, you know, the wounds are still so suffered, and then I realized that something that a Brazilian writer he wrote something like this: stories don't want to become history. And I think maybe I should go the other way around, okay, to try to make history change it into small stories, and this is the way I think it's the easiest way for me, at least. Okay.
You know, I was interested in what I saw as a kind of kinship in the character of Imani. Like, one thing that's important about her is she's placed structurally so she is integral and kind of almost like a pawn for people on both sides of a conflict. And it kind of reminded me in a sense of a figure like the biblical Moses, and then Moshe is another embodiment of it, someone who is quite literally like a member of the Egyptians and a member of the Jewish people, both at the same time in one body. It has sort of this conflict, and I feel like it's done differently, but in an interesting way with Moshe. And it fractures almost, I use the word fracture, I guess. It fractures another way with Andrés Watanabe, the way that it seems really important to have at least one, and actually in all of them a few characters, but who are at the crux of what appears to be sort of an unbridgeable divide. I guess one thing I'm curious is how conscious that was, or if it's just a natural magnetism that a figure like that has to sort of think about someone who's positioned like that. Imani actually reminded me like of a Queen Esther, both because she's sort of the wife of the emperor, but has like a special piece of power. So I'm curious how the characters came to you. I mean, almost especially Mr. Watanabe seems superficially so far from Andres's sort of, you know, life and geography, and yet feels so close. So I'm curious how those characters came to each of you, those characters who are sort of at a crux point like that between different powers, different pressures.
Okay. Maybe I can say something about Imani, or I want to speak about her. I'm speaking about myself. Okay, so I think for me it's important to reveal. I was born in I'm a son of a European, so I was born in an African country, and I fight for the independence of the country. So I travel inside myself through different identities, and now I'm living in a part of a country that is 99% of Black people. You know, they are the leaders. Black people are the leaders. They are I work. My boss in my company is a Black person. You know, the police in the streets, they are all Black. So I realized that this is my place. This is my you know, this is where I want to be. This is part of me, and I don't feel like I have you know, a racial identity when I'm inside Mozambique. I'm a Mozambican, and this is part of the story that we have built. So in my books, I think I want to take in this you know, the way I've lived all this experience. Okay, so I've traveled through different identities. There's more than 25 different people with different languages, with different religions in Mozambique. So, and they share. So there's nothing to. So there's no way to search for a pure identity now or in the past, because Mozambique, as an African country, as all African.
We just lost your sound.
Yeah.
Can you come back in?
Sorry.
Yeah.
I've touched the wrong button. It's always like this. It's a metaphor for my life, of my life. So
there's no voice for delicate matters.
Thank you. Save me, Andrés. I think I was in the end. So this is again. So all this speech was against this idea that Africans or some ethnic groups inside Africa have, you know, a pure identity. All of them are these exchanges and transitions of identities, negotiation of our historical contexts.
But also it interests me that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. You go ahead, Rivka.
Oh, I just wanted to say, also, I was curious to hear from you about Imani, like you were drawn to putting her in a place in the plot so that she has power on both sides. Like
and she is.
I just thought that was sort of interesting, that I felt like all of you were drawn to characters that all sides were claiming or claiming, not as in like an identity, but as in trying to use them to get something.
Her power her power comes from the way she dominates, she controls, and she feels herself in her mother language, which is Xixope, okay, and in Portuguese language. So this is the way she's exercising her own power in both lands, in the Portuguese world and in the African world. So that's, language is something that she knows, gives her this special power.
Curdella?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I come from a place of crossings, the Caribbean is like that, and the Americas, all of them born in crossing, cultural crossing, racial crossing, all of that, language crossing. So I can't imagine myself actually creating a character who doesn't in some way reflect that or refract that. So, but Moshe, I really like this guy, one of my favorite characters, I'm sorry. Just intrigued me, as he presented himself to me, because he, as I said, one of the things that is interesting about where he grows up in rural Jamaica is that people are used to crossings and they're used to difference, and they sort of take on anybody, the guy who prophesies in the street and, has his 2 feet turned the other way. Let's just accept that's who he is, that's who he is. And then here comes this guy who is like, challenging even that acceptance. It's a different kind of crossing. And it's like they have to learn all of that all over again. And it was just very interesting to me to watch how people would embrace him. He's one of us, but they would also be constantly dissecting him and saying, well, what's wrong with this boy? How did God make him like this? Something is wrong here, And so he put, what that is like. I guess part of what intrigued me was how, so you accept crossing, you accept how things are that way. That's part of life. That's part of the asymmetry of life. And that becomes a kind of standard, a kind of tradition. And then the tradition is turned back on itself because it has to look at the extreme, manifestation of itself, and suddenly doesn't recognize itself anymore. So that interested me a lot about him. And he himself, but he also said, he never thought he was a victim. He said, well, the thing is, I thought that my being here would change the world if people could fit me into the world and accept me. But then he said, whatever I was asking of anybody else, I had to ask of myself too. I had to accept other people and their space as well as different. So I guess he was, that in what is marked in Moshe's body is really that history of difference coexisting in a kind of heterogeneous way and then being troubled at different nodes.
One thing I found so powerful about I also really like the guy, but maybe you loved him even more. But I thought it was like a very smart decision. I mean, it seems like the natural arc of every story we're always moved to tell is tragic. It just comes to us first, right? It's the tragic arc. And in a sense, many good things come to Moshe. And all sorts of tragedies in history are evoked. But I thought that was an interesting decision that you had the reader find a way to love someone who wasn't just plummeting. I just feel that's a more normal fictional trope because artwork.
I mean, victim stories don't work. They just don't work. It's certainly not in the part of the world where I come from. I can't, I didn't want him to be the victim of history or anything like that. I didn't, his agency, his dignity, if you like, as a human simulacrum, as some to keep their dignity, you know, and that is important. And he himself never feels that way, that he's a victim or anything. He says that he made choices. Some were made for him, but in the end, he felt that he had the arc of his life, you know, where it mattered really. So that is crucial for me. I can't do those, you know, that's not part of how I grew up. It's not part of our tradition, to lie down and die, or to allow the facts of the known facts of history to decide how we are, because there's always something bigger and larger than that. And that's why, partly also why it's a love story. It has to be a love story. Quite apart from that, I love love stories. I can't not. I'm a romantic, born and bred. But Ariane says something very important to she says, when you love somebody. No, he says it to Ariane. When you love somebody, when you see somebody, really see them down to their skeleton, you love them. There's a larger human connection. Part of what Andrés is talking about, to some extent, if I may say, that allows people to live human. Yeah.
Besides narrative, I think it needs perspective.
Yes.
So sometimes you need to go apparently far away from your own roots to see yourself more clearly.
Yes.
Secondly, as for me, I'm sadly very used to be so far away from my roots or the place I was born, and being really far away from my loved ones, and that becomes a narrative device also.
Yes.
But for instance, mentioning Fractal and the character Watanabe, I was really interested in setting a comparison among places that apparently are very far away from each other, and try to find out if there is some kind of pattern, if there's some kind of pattern that make, for instance, victims of distant tragedies feel very much the same, or loving or fearing in the same language in a way. And when the Fukushima accident happened, I was very moved to read that the planet's axis had been shifted by a few centimeters, as if the whole planet had been literally moved by this horrible event. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor of how everything that matters can't be divided by orthodox official borders. There's a quote in the beginning of Fracture from the Polish poet Miłosz, which says, if something exists somewhere, it will exist everywhere. Can you beat that in our pandemic times? So poetry is always right.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's interesting. You all wrote love stories. I mean, love is very, it's like a powerful mover in all three of the books. And I did want to ask, with Mr. Watanabe, I thought like it was also an interesting relationship to tragedy. So you had him both personally be someone who didn't think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also you referred to the fact that for, more than a decade, you weren't allowed to speak of it. So he has this kind of, almost like the guilt of sometimes having a good life. He has in some ways a good life in certain ways, in at least in the sense that he escaped certain tragedies. But you have this little wonderful thing I love, which is the book often calls him Mr. Watanabe. And I just wanted to ask about that little decision to keep that Mr. there, sort of what that was.
Well, first of all, the name comes from a Japanese Peruvian poet, one of my favorite Latin American poets, called Jose Watanabe, whose poetry shows this crisscrossing approach to language that Curdella was talking about. And it's a very common name in Japan. The interesting thing about this character is that he travels to Argentina, my country, he travels to Spain, my other country, he travels to France, always due to work commitments where I live too. So he becomes a kind of super border character. And he is vaguely inspired in one of the most impressive, real human beings that ever existed or I have heard of. It's Mr. Yamaguchi, who survived 2 atomic bombs because he was working first in Hiroshima and he came back home to Nagasaki just in time to suffer a second atomic bomb. He lived for almost 100 years. Not only survived, but lived 90-something years. And he was the only person officially acknowledged by the Japanese authorities. When I read about this man, I wonder if he hadn't died shortly before the Fukushima accident, what he would have felt, what he would have done. So I invented a character who lives through all that and then begins a travel after an entire life trying to somehow escape this tragedy. Because, you know, I was researching the Spanish Civil War victims, their silence. Did they want to talk about it or did they want to go on with their lives? I set a comparison with the victims of the so-called dirty war. Let me say it was just the dictatorship, not the war, but I know in English is usually called dirty war. In my opinion, it's just the dictatorship. And how the victims had to be silenced in order, you know, not to disturb what we call democracy. So I began to find out, or in France, right after the World War II, nobody wanted to talk about the cooperation with the Nazis and the killings of the Jewish. And then, of course, in Japan, the people who survived the atomic bombs were horribly silenced by the media and the authorities because they didn't want to be reminded their defeat on the war. So I began to read between lines and see there was a kind of silent community of translating pain mixed with the yearning for a good life in spite of all. So the novel tries to travel to every single spot where the character lives and ask the very same question in different languages and ages. What can we do to go on with our lives without forgetting the cracks of the past?
That reminds me of the sort of opening passage that Mia read, almost the sort of ghosts that sort of come up from the anthills. That's all we have time for. I want to thank you guys for a beautiful conversation. Thank you for 3 beautiful books. And I want to remind everyone who's watching that you can order the books at the bottom. So thank you, Mia. Thank you, Curdella. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you all.
Thank you
It's been a
for having
pleasure.
me.